Graham. One of my favorite quotes about Wendy, and there are a lot of them, is that she was called the Margaret Thatcher of financial regulation by the Wall Street Journal. She has founded the Regulatory Studies program at George Mason University. Of course, she was head of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and Ronald Reagan said she was his favorite economist. So my favorite chairman of the board, Wendy Graham.
I'll tell you a story about, maybe I shouldn't. Yes. Oh, yeah. About Ronald Reagan. It is true, he did write on a picture, sign the picture, and said I was his favorite economist. But for those of you who knew Ronald Reagan, he wasn't crazy about economists. So I don't know how great a compliment that was. He thought about abolishing the Council of Economic Advisors, remember that? And he used to tell the joke about how he was standing with, I don't know, Russian, whoever it was, whether or not it was Gorbachev, it wasn't Gorbachev, but it was some Russian. And he said, I want to show you our military. So they went and they watched all the Russian military going by, display of armor, display of men, and all of this. And then at the end of the parade, there was a scraggly bunch of scruffy old folks kind of shuffling around. So Ronald Reagan says, I turned to him and said, who's that? And the Russian premier turned to him and said, oh, those are the economists. I usually don't tell that story because I do like being called his favorite economist. However, let me thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you, and I'm so glad we're having this open session here with our partners. Advancing the ideas of freedom, free enterprise, and limited government is not something that just a few people can do, as we learned this past election. It's something that we all really need to do better, and we need to engage everybody that we know who can and will help us along the way. So we're delighted to partner with all these folks who believe in these principles of our founding fathers. I want to thank you, Senator Cornyn, for what you do in Washington. Let me tell you about being in the arena. Charlton Heston, and I guess it was Teddy Roosevelt that first talked about it. There's nothing like being in the arena. And as someone said earlier this evening at the governor's mansion, there are lots of arenas, and we can all battle in our various arenas. But the arena that you battle in, Senator Cornyn, is like no other. I remember my introduction to that arena. I had gone to Washington with my husband, who was a member of Congress, and I was off from academics. Obviously, I'd helped campaign, but I wasn't terribly all that politically involved. I was sort of more of an, just a apolitical academic doing my thing, and I worked for this defense-related think tank. But then with the Reagan administration, some of my former colleagues and friends who were in the Reagan administration, economists, a bunch of them, kept trying to get me to work in the federal government. And I said, no, I don't want to be a bureaucrat. And Phil said, no, I don't want to be married to a bureaucrat. Anyway, but after about 5 months, and they kept harassing me to join them, I finally said, I ought to do it. It's like doing some service to the government. And also, Washington is a one-industry town, and since I'm here, why shouldn't I try and see what it was like? And what better time than with a president whose views I agreed with, and also with people I knew that I'd be working for. At least I knew them. I knew what they were like. It's not like going to some bureaucracy buried someplace. I knew Jim Miller. I knew Bob Tollison. I knew all these Buchanan folks. Jim Buchanan, Nobel laureate, who has just died, had a lot of influence on a lot of people who went into government. So I said, I'll go do it. So the first thing I did when I went to the Federal Trade Commission working for Jim Miller, I tagged along to a hearing. and I could not believe it. It was just incredible. The hearing that was conducted, it wasn't just a hearing, it was a bashing session to bash Jim Miller for his principles and for the things that he believed in, and also for, well, you know, differences in opinion. And that's when I realized what an incredible job, what I consider a pretty lousy job Phil had, because he had to work with these people, all right? Who, when they come to a hearing, first of all, they come in and they rant and rave about how could you spend money on this X, Y, Z, or whatever, and then they sit down and you try to explain, and they're off writing and doing whatever they're doing, and then the next person comes in and he gives the same speech. How could you spend all this money doing X, Y, Z, right? 7 times. I said, what is this, right? But at any rate, that's where I learned what a tough job it is to work in those circumstances every single day. And it made me appreciate Phil, who was a Democrat, by the way. I was working the Reagan administration, right? This was a little unusual. So, but at any rate, it was a very interesting introduction. And I want you to know, Senator Cornyn, not only what Brooke said, that we really appreciate the fact that you spend so much time and effort to come and be with us and help the Texas Public Policy Foundation and speak to our folks. We really appreciate the time and effort, not only that you bring here to Texas, but what you do in Washington, in that arena, every single day. And I know that being on the Texas Supreme Court wasn't all fun and games either, but it's nothing like what you have to deal with now. So thank you so much. And listen, if you don't know what it's like, some of you will know because you're glued to C-SPAN or something, right? But it is even more amazing than you can believe. And we appreciate the work you do for limited government, freedom, and free enterprise. And let me also say a word to Sandy. I go everywhere and I see John everywhere, Senator Cornyn, excuse me, everywhere. And Sandy's always there. She's always here to support and be with him. And we really appreciate the time that you've given to us as well and what you're giving to the people of Texas. So thank you so much. And now, what more can I say about Steve Moore, right? I mean, he's just been fabulous. We're getting a little used to him coming and gracing us at TPPF. You will do that, right? I mean, listen, there's so much we have to thank you for. You know, you're in a different arena, to be sure. But boy, your ideas and your work, from the Club for Growth to the Free Enterprise Fund to the Wall Street Journal. What would we do without the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, right? Thank you for all you do, and thank you for being here. So we have a treat for you tonight, because these two fine fellows are going to be having a conversation here, and it's going to be a great night. Now, what we're going to do in terms of the questions, if you have questions for them, if you will write them on a card, we'll have someone out there collecting cards so that we can come up and bring the cards up to the front. And Steve, I guess you'll be the one who'll sort through, and we can get as many topics covered as we possibly can. And so that's how that will work. Now, as Brooke said earlier, that this was going to be a conversation with our new Senator Ted Cruz as well, but he was called away, and so, but instead, we do have a video.
Good evening. I'm very sorry to miss everyone this evening. I had hoped and intended to join you tonight, but a last-minute scheduling conflict caused me to come yesterday to the conference rather than today. So tonight you will be left in the very, very capable hands of Texas's senior Senator John Cornyn. Senator Cornyn is an extraordinary man, and I'm very much looking forward to working side by side with him in fighting for the principles that all of us share. You know, the Texas Public Policy Foundation is a jewel of an institution. It is hands down the outstanding free market state think tank across the country. And I have been honored to work very, very closely with TPPF. In 2010, my friend Brooke Rollins called and asked me if I might consider helping lead the newly formed Center for 10th Amendment Studies at TPPF. Brooke then began to wind up on a long explanation of why it was such a great idea to form the center and why she thought I would do a decent job of helping lead it. And I have to admit, I went a little Jerry Maguire on her. I just started laughing and said, Brooke, you had me at hello. This combines two of my favorite things. Number one, the 10th Amendment, which I have been a student of and a fan of practically all my life. And number two, TPPF, which does extraordinary work fighting for principles of freedom. This is a time where our nation is facing enormous challenges. I've only been in Washington serving in office just a few days so far, and yet already we're seeing the Obama administration push even further to dig the hole we're in even deeper, to raise taxes, to spend more money, to expand our deficit and our debt. It seems a lot of people in Washington don't understand the urgency of the fiscal and economic crisis this country faces. And at the same time, they don't understand that there is a better path. And in fact, one doesn't need to look far. One can look around this room and see the better path. Texas has demonstrated that when you limit government spending, when you restrain taxes, when you have a regulatory environment that encourages entrepreneurs, that encourages small businesses, the result is extraordinary. Freedom works. The Texas model works. And I very much hope in the next 6 years serving in office to play at least some small part in helping bring the Texas model of economic freedom and limited government to Washington. Helping turn around the Leviathan in Washington and empower the American people. And so as you prepare to have this what I'm sure will be terrific discussion with Senator John Cornyn, I want to close with just a brief thought of encouragement from me, which is number one, ideas matter. Number two, freedom works. And number three, economic liberty. Free men and free women unchained from government in the United States has produced the greatest prosperity and the greatest opportunity, the greatest advancement from poverty to material comfort and providing for our children that the world has ever seen. That's what we're all fighting for, to ensure opportunity for the next generations. And I'm honored to be standing alongside each of you. God bless you, and God bless Texas.
So thank you very much, and now we'll have the senior senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn, and Steve Moore.
Good evening, folks. Wendy, thank you so much for the nice comments. I've been looking forward to doing this for a long time. I'm such a great admirer of Senator Cornyn, who, by the way, we were chatting. I first met Senator Cornyn in Dallas when he first started running for the Senate seat that the great Phil Gramm was vacating. And I remember I told him, because I'd never met you before, I said, I hope that you will, fulfill the ideals of Phil Gramm. I don't think there's anybody who could have possibly done a better job than John Cornyn has in that regard. And Wendy, I hope you will send our best to Senator Gramm, who is just a great, great American, one of the great, in my lifetime, maybe the single greatest senator that we've had in the United States Senate. So tell him that we are great admirers of this. And thank you for mentioning the Wall Street Journal. How many of you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page? How many of you do? Thank you for helping pay my salary. I just wanted to give you a little bit of good news. But, the newspaper business, as you know, Senator Cornyn, is not exactly a growth industry these days. It's a tough business. But of the 5 major newspapers in the country today, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Washington Post, LA Times, and the New York Times, only one of those newspapers is making money. Anybody want to take a guess what paper that is? The Wall Street Journal. And I have some even better news for you, by the way, that I don't know how many of you have looked at the finances recently of the New York Times, but that newspaper is about this close to being in federal bankruptcy court. It's just going to happen. So thank you again for being here, Senator Cornyn. I know how busy you are, and I just want to add to the thanks for you being here. So I just want to have a conversation with you about a little bit about politics, about the policy frontiers that are ahead of you. We've already gotten some good questions, so please do pass those questions forward. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. And let me start with the kind of sour note, which is this frustrating election that we've just lived through. Many of us, I said earlier today that I'm still at about the third or fourth stage of recovering from this election. I'm past denial and depression, but I do think it's critical that we, as a movement, understand what went wrong and try to correct the things that went wrong so that it doesn't happen again. And I wanted to start by just getting your assessment of why the Republicans underperformed in this last election. What are some of the things that you think over the next 4 years Republicans have to do differently so that we put a Republican in the White House in 2016?
Well, it's great to be here with you, Stephen, and thank you for all you do to help at the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, help provide great ammunition for people like me, the intellectual firepower we need in order to do our jobs. And of course, I would be negligent if I didn't express my appreciation to TPPF for the same reason. I mean, you are the ones that help us think through complex subjects and come up with a free market, free enterprise answer of limited government, not bigger government taking over. But I think the one thing that I know that doesn't need to change, or that really wasn't litigated in 2012, is our principles. I just don't believe that the American people express themselves on our most fundamental principles. So what happened? Well, there was a exit poll, one of the exit polls that asked people, who do you think cares about people like you? It was 81 to 18 in Barack Obama's favor.
That's devastating.
And it's hard, I believe, to get people to vote for you if they don't think you care about them. And I'm not talking about the paternalistic approach that Obama and his administration takes where government, it's sort of what the life of Julia, you remember that
Yes.
digital story about from cradle to grave, how the government would take care of Julia by supplying her every need. I think what we need to do a better job of, and with people like Ted Cruz, I'm convinced we will, is explain why free markets and limited government and our agenda and our principles produce a better outcome for the American people, and how that is an expression of our care and our concern about their future, about their ability to find work due to a strong economy and limited common sense government regulation and a tax system that doesn't take more than it should from the hard-working small businesses and entrepreneurs. So I think we have to do a better job of expressing our principles in terms of what that translates into in terms of tangible benefit for the American people. I can't agree more that, in Texas, we sometimes take it a little bit for granted because it's sort of where we start from, who we are, where we come from, that the private sector produces the growth and the jobs and the opportunity, the prosperity that have helped us become the leading state in the nation. But as you know, Washington's a much different culture. So the last thing I would mention is that no one believed that the Obama team would be able to turn out their vote like they did in 2008. And indeed, there were diminished numbers, but basically they had their essential coalition turn out. And we've got a lot of work to do, and I know Wrights Priebus is leading that effort at the Arkansas.
So on that issue, the president did a good job, clearly, of getting his vote out. Republicans didn't do such a good job of turnout. In fact, I was shocked that fewer people voted, I think I'm right about this, I may be wrong, that fewer people voted for Mitt Romney than John McCain in this, and that's given the fact that in 2008, there were so many factors running against the Republicans, and that suggests that Republicans, there were millions of Americans who we would have hoped had turned out to vote Republican that didn't.
That's right.
And I wonder, why you think, I'm puzzled by that. I wonder if you have an explanation for it.
Well, I think part of it is that message that we care about these people, and so they feel that connection, so they're going to turn out and respond by giving us the vote. There were some mistakes made by the Romney campaign, no doubt. The infamous 47% comment that was caught on tape that sort of reinforced a negative image of we don't care. And then the Obama campaign, I think we have to concede, did a masterful job of creating a caricature of Mitt Romney as a plutocrat, somebody who was not a man of the people. I know a lot of folks in his campaign tried to get him to tell more of the story of who he was as a man and as a human being and the good things he's done outside of government to help people. And there was some internal fight over that. But I just think he was the strongest candidate we had. The Obama team was relentless and ruthless, and from a tactical standpoint, they turned out their vote, and we didn't. So one irrefutable law of politics I found, Steve, is that he or she who turns out the most votes wins every time.
That usually works. So we had, as Brooke mentioned, we actually had a fascinating discussion today about immigration, mostly about policy, but we got involved a little bit in the politics of the issue. That issue, I think most people would agree, is not working well for Republicans, and you could see that in the results that happened in November, where Republicans got less than 30% of the Hispanic vote, which is just a dreadful result. Republicans have to do much better than that. And surprisingly, Republicans even lost the Asian vote, which is shocking because Asians are the wealthiest ethnic group in America, where Asians make more money than whites do. That suggests that Republicans aren't doing a very good job of communicating with ethnic voters. And I wonder if you all in the Senate and others in the command posts of the Republican Party are really looking at new ways to get this message across to Latinos, to Asians, and other ethnic groups that are in many ways very conservative and share our values.
Well, there's some low-hanging fruit, and that would be, for example, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM bill that the House of Representatives passed recently. They substituted the Divisa lottery, which is just what it suggests. It's just a game of chance without regard to the contribution that the immigrant might make to the United States. And what it would do is to give people with masters and PhDs in math, science, and engineering an opportunity to get a green card and to stay in the United States after they've studied here and gotten their advanced degrees in these fields. To me, that seems like a no-brainer, and something that we ought to encourage. We couldn't even get the Senate under Harry Reid to take that bill up. And the truth is, they're holding that hostage, as they are other pieces of immigration legislation, because the holy grail to them is the pathway to citizenship for the people who are already here, the so-called 12 million or so. And I think
you have a problem with that idea of a path to citizenship. What about a path to legalization? Because we talked a little bit about this.
Well, I think there has to be some conditions precedent satisfied, and one is people need to know that we've done everything we can do to secure the border. Last year, there were roughly 340,000 people detained along our southwestern border, and you'd be amazed to see the countries they come from. It's not just Mexico, it's not just Central America, it's China, it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, admittedly not in the same numbers, but my point is, what it demonstrates is how porous our border is for a determined individual who comes up with the money to pay to come into the United States, which I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to say that makes us vulnerable to the sorts of attacks that we sustained on 9/11. And so it's a national security issue, and as well as a sovereignty issue. But I'm convinced we could get there with the adequate effort. We've come a long way. The numbers are way down, as you know, from where they were at the height. But I think that's part of the reassurance we need to give the American people, that we're serious about enforcing our laws and protecting our sovereignty and our national security. Then there's a matter of course, of work site enforcement. But I think in fairness to our American businesses and job creators, that we need to give them a means to determine whether the worker can legally work here and not leave it up to them to be the police. But then, things like the Republican platform at the state convention, the national convention calling for a guest worker program. I think certainly in the agricultural sector that's something that could work if we take care of the means to verify the eligibility and enforce it. And then I think, the American people are a compassionate people. Once they realize that we've done our job in terms of security and maintaining law and order, then I think they would find a way to deal with the 12 million people or so or less now perhaps who are here, but not necessarily a path to citizenship. I think some sort of probationary status that someone could, after serving a period of time on probation, they could work here and they could stay in the United States, but not necessarily be a pathway to citizenship.
We had this conversation at lunch, and one of the gentlemen in attendance asked this question, which I thought was very interesting. He suggested that maybe the president and Democrats don't really want to get this solved because it's a political winner for them to blame it all on Republicans. Do you think there's anything to that?
I couldn't agree more. I think this is like Lucy in the football. That every time we come up to kick the football, Lucy pulls it back and Charlie Brown ends up on his back. So, like so many problems that the administration has identified and which Americans have identified, this is one that I think they find a great political advantage not to solving. But to your initial point, I think it's in our country's interest, and certainly in our political interest as Republicans, to deal with this, to show that we are a party that welcomes people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and races as Americans, because the one thing that binds us as Americans is the idea of America, where people can come from all over the world and come here and work hard and take care of their family and achieve their dreams within a legal immigration system. And I think that's one we need to be the party of legal immigration, not the party of illegal immigration, which I believe that the Democrats are.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the money, financial issues, which I think are almost at the top of everybody's mind these days. You've lived through this the last 6 to 8 weeks, which have been extremely frustrating with the president in terms of trying to get a deal on this so-called fiscal cliff. I'm kind of the mind that the deal you struck may be, it's not something any of us like, but it may have been the best deal that you could have gotten, although some conservatives are still angry at the Congress for, quote, caving in. What is your attitude about what happened in that process? What were the lessons learned? And do you think this was the best deal that you could have cut?
Well, I'm with those who were angry at this contrived and manufactured crisis. But again, this is placing a premium on politics over actually solving the problem. The president, and we all knew this day was coming, but indeed about 6 months ago, Patty Murray, chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee in the Senate, gave a speech at Brookings, where she said they would be willing to go off the fiscal cliff, which means by definition that all of the temporary tax provisions would expire December the 31st, and we would see all of the Clinton-era tax rates restored to full to life, which would be the single largest tax increase in American history. And this was a unique situation we found ourselves in, where it wouldn't take positive legislation to pass those tax rates. It was by default. And so we all knew that something had to happen to protect as many taxpayers as we could. And I realized how controversial it is, and it was, but I had this basic choice to make. Was I going to try to do the very best I could to avoid a tax increase on 99% of Americans and Texans, or were we going to go over the cliff and let taxes go up on everybody? Now, I think higher taxes are going to dampen our economic recovery. And forgive me, I'm a lawyer, not an economist.
You're 100% right about
that. But even I understand that. And I think we're going to have consequences associated with all this increased tax burden on small businesses and entrepreneurs and individuals in addition to the Obamacare taxes and all the other things going on. So I think this is a terrible deal, but like you suggested earlier, I think it was the best deal we could do under the circumstances. But I would just ask those who are as angry as I am that we find ourselves in this quandary to please remember this was the first battle, it was not the war. The war is going to be fought in the next couple of months over the sequester, over the debt ceiling, and over the expiring continuing resolution or appropriations. And I will tell you, that's going to be a battle royale because we finally figured out what my father once told me growing up. He said, son, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We now know that President Obama will never negotiate in good faith over spending cuts or entitlement reform. So we're going to have to extract it. And that's what I think the next couple of months will be about.
So I was surprised, I don't know if maybe I shouldn't have been shocked, but the ink wasn't even dry on that deal before Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and President Obama were all saying, we need more taxes in 2013. We need, in addition to the $500 billion of the Obamacare taxes and the $600 billion tax increase that was signed into law last week, they're now saying we need another $1 trillion or $2 trillion of taxes. Can you tell us definitively here tonight the Republicans will not raise taxes in 2013?
Absolutely, absolutely. As bad as the deal was and the circumstance we found ourselves in, I think what Obama now has to understand is having, by definition, raised taxes on the rich, and we can argue with that characterization, the only thing left is the middle class. And I think you're right. There's never enough money to satisfy the left. And we know that government consumes about, what, 24, up to 25% of GDP, where historically we've been around the 20% level. So this government is much bigger, much more expensive, much more intrusive than it's been in a long time, perhaps since the New Deal. And we've got to find a way to pare that back, and I think this is the opportunity.
Would you characterize your Republican colleagues in the Senate as being, are you pretty unified on this message that taxes are not going to be part of any?
Absolutely. I think you've heard Senator McConnell say revenue is off the table, we're done, we're not going there. And so now it's all about the second part of what President Obama likes to talk about as a balanced approach. Now comes the other half of that equation, which is spending.
Now, we've gotten a couple of questions in already about one of the issues you mentioned, which is the debt ceiling. This is a tricky one because we've lived through this before. In 2011, the debt ceiling became a big issue, and the Democrats are already saying, oh my gosh, the Republicans are going to cause a default on the debt. President Obama is saying this every day. He's saying, I'm not going to negotiate with the Republicans on this. Then you have John Boehner, who told me in an interview this week in the Wall Street Journal that he wants to enforce the so-called Boehner rule, which is that every additional dollar this debt is raised, that $1 of spending cuts will be necessary. Do you think the debt ceiling is going to be a point of debate? How do you see this playing out?
Well, of course, the president's sounds a lot like Chicken Little when it comes to the debt ceiling, and he's suggesting that somehow we would default on our debt. Again, I'm intruding in your area of expertise, but my understanding is we've got plenty of revenue to service our debt.
That's true.
And what happens is that we may have to delay paying some of the bills for a few days or a week while we work our way through this and come up with some real cuts in entitlement reform. But those people will be made whole. And as much as that is undesirable, I look across the Atlantic Ocean and see what's happening in Europe and places like Greece. And I am not willing to go there and do that to my country. So no matter what the inconvenience may be, the temporary disruption caused by delaying the raising of the debt ceiling in exchange for what Speaker Boehner is referring to, hopefully entitlement reform, putting Medicare and Social Security back on a solid path. I think that's something we need to consider.
Now, on this issue of the other kind of point of leverage that you have going forward is the fact that, and I wonder how many people in this room know this. How many of you are aware that it has been almost 1,400 days, right? 1,400 days since Harry Reid has passed a budget out of the Senate. How many of you knew that? About 3/4 of the people in this room know that, but I think a lot of Americans don't know that.
And it's an outrage. Right. The law requires Congress to pass a budget. The problem, as you know, is there's no real enforcement mechanism. And shame doesn't work.
It doesn't work very well in Washington.
Embarrassment
doesn't work in Washington. It may work in Austin.
It should work, but it doesn't with Harry Reid. And this is an outrage. As you know, the House has dutifully passed a budget every year under the leadership of Paul Ryan, and they sent it over to the Senate. And the Democrats, I served on the Budget Committee for the last few years, Kent Conrad couldn't get Harry Reid to bring it to the floor. We did. By some procedural moves by Mitch McConnell, our Republican leader, get to vote on the president's proposed budget, and it went down unanimously.
97-0.
Yeah, to 0. Got no votes because it wasn't a responsible budget, nor did it put us on a pathway to paying down the debt and fiscal responsibility. So that's where we are right now, and we're in the minority.
The question is, I mean, I agree with you. It is a total outrage. I mean, the one constitutional responsibility of the Congress is to pass a budget. I would like to see.
That's why, for example, I just want to interject. I've Dean Heller from Nevada, one of our new senators, has a bill. It's called "No Budget, No Pay."
I'm
a co-sponsor of that bill. I think we ought to cut off the pay of Congress until the Senate passes a budget.
So you kind of took the words out of my mouth. I was going to just say, don't you? I mean, this is something I think Republicans need to be very forceful about. In fact, one of the ideas that the House is talking about, I wonder what your reaction to this is. They would pass a debt ceiling bill that would extend the debt ceiling with maybe some provisions on it, but one of those provisions would be that this debt ceiling does not go forward until the United States Senate passes a budget out of the Senate.
I think that makes a lot of sense. We may need to go further than that, but I kind of like the image of that. As you know, the House has passed a lot of common sense legislation. It comes over into the Senate graveyard, because under our practice, only the majority leader can actually call it up, as you know, and Democrats are in the majority. But I like that. I hope they consider that. I also like the precedent that was established under the last debt ceiling rule, where you have a dollar for dollar and cuts. I mean, I hope we could do more than that, and particularly in terms of unfunded liabilities of Medicare and Social Security, which don't necessarily show up in that 10-year budget window as significant cuts, but going in the out years in terms of solvency could mean a whole lot.
Now, the other point of leverage that you have, in fact, again, when I interviewed Speaker Boehner, he said it might be our ultimate point of leverage, is this sequester that starts in March 1st. It was supposed to start on January 1st. As part of this deal, they delayed that for 2 months. There's some disagreement, it seems, on the Republican side of the aisle about whether this is a card that Republicans should play. Some of the senators like Lindsey Graham and John McCain, who I deeply respect, as you do, say that those defense cuts would be very significant and damaging to our national security. On the other hand, this may be the only opportunity to get, as I think some of the House Republicans say, it may not be a very good way to cut federal spending, but it may be the only way to do it. I wonder what your attitude is about that sequester and whether you think that's a point of leverage against President Obama, because that's going to hit some of those programs he cares about pretty severely.
Well, I'll start with the fact that I am a proud national security hawk.
Right.
I believe that the most important responsibility the federal government has is to keep the American people safe. And that's not negotiable. So I saw my friend Gordon England here, who served as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he may fall out of his chair when he hears me say this, but I think that some of the people who say that the sequester may be the most immediate cuts we can get are right under this administration. I think the desirable way to handle this would be to go back and reprogram the sequester so it doesn't bite so heavily into defense because defense has already given about $500 billion in cuts. This would be another $500 billion on top of it, something that Secretary Panetta said would be devastating to our national security. But this is the one reason why I am opposing the nomination of Chuck Hagel What I fear is President Obama has found maybe one nominal Republican who would preside over a Department of Defense where those devastating cuts would actually be implemented and executed. And in addition to other problems like negotiating with Hamas, trying to not drawing red lines for an Iranian nuclear weapon and other outrageous positions that Senator Hagel has taken. But I think we've got to make sure that the Defense Department is spending the money properly. I'm a co-sponsor along with Dr. Tom Coburn of an audit, the Department of Defense bill. Right, believe it or not, that's one federal agency that doesn't have the ability to produce an auditable financial statement yet. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but we don't need to hollow out our military. We know we still live in a dangerous world. We have to remember that is the single most important role of the federal government. So I may be willing to allow the sequester to take effect, but I'll be working as fast as I can, as hard as I can. We come back and try to backfill the Department of Defense so that we don't jeopardize our national security in a very dangerous world.
So I'm going to read this question from one of our gentlemen in the audience. I won't mention his name, and I'm just going to read it verbatim, and I'll let you answer it. Do the Senate Republicans have the backbone to actually cut spending? Not bogus, quote, cuts to the baseline budget, but real, honest-to-goodness cuts.
Yes. The thing I would just ask, I don't know who wrote the question, is, the problem, you don't get to $16.5 trillion in debt unless both parties have had their fingerprints on the problem. When I got to the Senate about 10 years ago, I still remember people talking about deficits of 3% as being not a problem. But nobody ever dreamed that you'd have somebody like this president and this administration that would take those deficits from 3% to 10%, where we'd have trillion-dollar annual deficits piled one on top of another and grow the national debt by 55%, I believe the figure is, in the Obama administration. So clearly, things have gotten out of control. We're not going to have money to pay for national security or safety net programs or anything else if interest rates start to go up. And again, I'm intruding in your area of expertise with the Fed buying the bonds and trying to keep interest rates down artificially. If they were just to restore to historic norms, we'd be in deep trouble.
So, here's the thing that's puzzled me, and maybe I shouldn't be puzzled by this. I've been in Washington 28 years, a lot longer than you have, and I guess I'm puzzled by the Democrats, that they seem so unconcerned about these things. It seems self-evident to everyone in this room and most common sense people who know anything about finances that the U.S. government can't keep borrowing $1 trillion year after year, that this is not a story that has a happy ending. You mentioned Greece. Do your Senate Democratic colleagues not care about this? Do they not understand?
This is the most maddening part about it. The answer is they do understand, except for maybe Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie is the only self-avowed socialist. He's the so-called independent from Vermont, so maybe Bernie I wouldn't include in this, but virtually every other senator.
So why don't they do something?
Understands this. Well, starting with the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which was not something that I would enthusiastically embrace, but at least it was a start toward trying to deal with these problems. Had President's own fiscal commission he walked away from in December 2010 when they reported that Domenici and Rivlin, the bipartisan policy committee, I think it's called, in D.C., came out with their own proposal. You had the Gang of Six with Kent Conrad, Dick Durbin, and others meeting with an equal number, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. Everybody understands this problem, but it takes leadership and it takes courage. And that's what's sadly missing, and particularly with this president. It is beyond disappointing, And as I said earlier, many people held out some hope that after the 2010 election that Barack Obama would turn into Bill Clinton after the 1994 election, where he would become pragmatic. And I even thought that if he had embraced his own Simpson-Bowles Commission, it would have been a big solution, or at least a big step to solving a big problem. It would make him appear statesmanlike, it would be bipartisan, it would help him get reelected. But you know, we're Americans first and party members second. And so I was hoping he would actually do that, but he did not have the courage nor exhibit the leadership to do what needs to be done. So yes, I believe the president understands it. I believe there's broad understanding, but it takes leadership, it takes courage, and it takes some political cover for the Democrats by the president taking the lead.
Is that going to happen?
No.
Okay. Let's see, I wanted to ask about, this is an issue I don't know virtually anything about. I mean, I'm just a pedestrian on this issue because it has to do with foreign policy, but it's on the, I noticed there were about 3 or 4 people who asked about this, the Benghazi disaster, and whether you will get to the bottom of this.
Yes, now that Secretary Clinton is feeling better, even after her term is over of office, she's scheduled to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I think it's on the 22nd of January. This is one of those stories where almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But if the president and the administration had just been honest about it and told the truth and were transparent up front, people would have been criticized, some may have been fired and held accountable, but there wouldn't be any of this scandal associated with it. But when 4 Americans die because the U.S. government didn't do its job, and when there were, you've had a cover-up like this, people are justifiably outraged, and we will get to the bottom of it.
We had 2 or 3 questions from Rick tells us, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I just have time for 1 or 2 very quick final questions. 2 or 3 people asked about unconstitutional executive orders by the White House and what you might do in the Senate to stop that. And let me actually just add something to that. You mentioned regulations. Those are an enormous cost to the economy. And one of the things I've been frustrated with, this is I guess more with the House, because that's controlled by the Republicans, not the Senate, but the Senate would have some of this authority too, to take a more active role in Congress in the oversight of these regulatory agencies so that you're not giving carte blanche to the Lisa Jacksons and so on. I mean, I was struck at lunch that a gentleman said that some of these new EPA rules are just putting out of business many businesses here in the state of Texas in terms of their ability to get water and energy and things of that nature. So if you just take a minute to talk about those issues, about what you all can do to take a more proactive role because you know this president is going to be on a regulatory jihad over the next 4 years.
Well, and he has already, and I know that Vice President Biden's comments yesterday about possibly using executive order to regulate guns has caused a lot of law-abiding gun owners consternation and what they might try to do. But as you know, the executive branches from the beginning of the country have issued, the presidents have issued executive orders, none quite like this one. And there's really 2 ways to deal with it. One is through litigation, or you can deal with it through an oversight function, as you mentioned in the House. If you have the committees and the chairman, you can compel the witnesses, you can do the oversight. In the minority and the Senate were hampered that way. We've got something called the Congressional Review Act, which you're no doubt familiar with, Steve, that we can, if we can get the votes, we can actually override regulations that have been issued that are job killers and really an overreach. But unfortunately, when you elect a president with the vast power that a president has to appoint these agency heads and to issue regulations and executive orders, we're playing a game of defense. And right now, I think the economy would be doing much better. And this is, again, the thing that drives me nuts about this president is he talks about the importance of jobs, but so much of what he does in terms of government, taxes, regulation, just the uncertainty of settling a lot of these issues to give people some predictability so they can plan. All of those are hurting our economic recovery. And his answer, unfortunately, is more government and bigger government. And we have a better answer in terms of our freedom agenda and the free enterprise system and the private sector creating those jobs and the prosperity and the opportunity. And also, by the way, helping us pay the bills when people are working, they're taxpayers, and helps us close that gap as well.
The final question is with respect to 2016. Already people are looking forward to how Republicans can take back the White House in 2016. I've heard a lot of names being mentioned, including your senator as a potential nominee for the Republican Party. I wonder if there are...
about the junior senator.
I was wondering if you have any... If you see, I'm not asking you to pick favorites, but who you see out there are some of the bright young stars of the Republican Party. Is there a Barack Obama or a Ronald Reagan waiting out there for the Republican Party that has that ability to connect with the American people in the way that the Gipper did?
Well, I'm sure there will be people who will come forward. We have a lot of really outstanding governors across the country. You know, people like Chris Christie, our own governor. I don't know whether he's going to make another run at it or not. We've got, Bob McDowell. We've got Scott Walker. Right. We've got a lot of great governors, great talent at the state level who have who've been to the laboratories of democracy to show how government can work in a limited fashion and allow the prosperity and opportunity we all want. And then you got people at the federal level like Marco Rubio, who I think is just one of the best and brightest stars we've had. He would help us too, I think, in some of the areas that you mentioned earlier where we need to do a better job of reaching out to other people to encourage them to become Republicans. And by the way, I haven't heard many people tell a better story about the opportunity society that America is than people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who've come from families who are second-generation immigrant families. So there's a number of people that I'm sure will step forward. My focus, of course, the next 4 years is going to be stopping as much damage as we can possibly do, hoping in 2014 we can take advantage of some of the Democratic senators who are from red states that went for Romney. There are about 6 of them, I believe. And hopefully we can get back in the majority in the Senate, working with our colleagues in the House. There's a whole lot we can do to stop the hemorrhaging and hopefully get us back on a better path and wait until we can elect a new president in 2016.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. It's been a real thrill for me to spend this 45 minutes or so with you. I just want to say, from an outsider, I'm not a Texan, but I do a lot of work, obviously, looking at the political situation in this country and do a lot of work with the senators. And I just want to tell you, I think that Texas now has the 2 best senators in the country. No other state has a better pair of senators than the state of Texas. So thank you for
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Senator Cornyn. It's always a pleasure, and Senator Cruz yesterday I think gave us a lot of hope, and Steve gave us some hope also, but I think you give us hope as well. And what Texas stands for is freedom and liberty, and you taking that and representing us in Washington is just a real pleasure. Will Rogers said that ancient Rome went into decline because it had a Senate, and then he said, what are we going to do in America with both a House and a Senate? And I think that with states doing what we're doing, and I think that with leaders like Senator John Cornyn and Senator Cruz, we will reclaim this country. So thank you so much for tonight.